Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 3, or more specifically, the practical aspects of Chapter 3. So we are going to start off by taking a look firstly at how to set up the Metasploit framework on Kali Linux. We'll then move to performing information gathering and footprinting on our target. Now, of course, there's more than one target that we have set up, so I'm only going to be focusing on gaining access to one of the targets. The objective of this video is to explain the practical aspects of gaining access to a target system with Metasploit and through utilizing other tools like Nmap, so on and so forth. So we're going to get started by as I said, performing information gathering after we have set up the Metasploit framework. We'll then take a look at how to assess or identify vulnerabilities on the target, and then finally how to exploit them to gain access or initial access onto the system, which will then set the stage for what we'll be covering later on in this book once we start taking a look at how to elevate our privileges on these target systems. With that being said, let's get started. Alright, so as mentioned, the first step in this process is setting up the Metasploit framework and making sure that it's up and running. Right, so the Metasploit framework by default comes prepackaged with Kali Linux and any other penetration testing distribution, and you should already have it installed on your Kali system. The first thing we want to do is we need to start up the PostgreSQL database service for the backend storage for Metasploit. So to do this, we're going to say sudo So we're going to say sudo system control start PostgreSQL, all right, and then we're going to hit enter, and that is going to start the service. We're going to give that a few seconds to start the service for us, and once that is done, you should be good to go. You can also check up the status of the service that you've just started by typing in status, and that should tell you that it's loaded and active. There we are. We can see that it's loaded and it's active, which means it's actually running. So that's done. The next thing we need to do is we need to initialize the Metasploit database. This can be done by running the following command. So we're going to say sudo msfdb, and we're initializing it, right? So if this is your first time with the Metasploit framework, you need to do this. This will initialize the database. In my case, it's already started and it's running. So in my case, it's not gonna initialize it for me. But in your case, it will initialize a new database for you. All right. Once that is done, essentially once we initialize the database, it's going to create the MSF database for us and add the MSF test rule to the database configuration. So what that does is essentially sets up the MSF database on the PostgreSQL server. The next thing we can do now is we need to test and see whether the Metasploit framework console is actually working. We can access it by typing in MSF console. So again, we want to give that a few seconds, and once it's started, we should again be greeted by a banner, a random banner that should tell us the version of Metasploit we're running, the number of exploits, payloads, etc. And then finally, we can again check to see whether the MSF, the Metasploit database is actually running. And again, we're just going to wait for it to load up. On your first startup, it shouldn't take more than a few minutes. But if it does persist, you might want to try reinstalling or updating the Metasploit framework package on Kali or on any other penetration testing distribution. So again, we're just going to wait for this to complete loading. All right, so it has completed loading, and don't worry if you get any messages regarding missing or modules that could not be loaded. This is perfectly fine. This is essentially a reference to the fact that a few modules could not be loaded. That's, again, as I said, that should be no reason for alarm, or should be no cause for alarm. Again, so Metasploit, the information printed in the banner will actually give you the version of Metasploit that you're currently running, the amount of exploits, auxiliary modules, the post-exploitation modules, the encoders, so on and so forth. So again, what we need to do now is we need to verify that the Metasploit database is actually running. This can be done by typing in db status. So db_status, we hit enter, and it's going to tell you connected to MSF. The connection type is of PostgreSQL, so it's actually connected to the PostgreSQL database server. So that means that we have everything ready to go, and we can move on to the next stages of the actual information gathering and exploitation phases. All right, so we're gonna, get started by taking a look at how to exploit the Windows 7 virtual machine that you set up. So the first thing we need to do is perform information gathering. All right, so what we're trying to do here is firstly discover the IP address of the Windows 7 virtual machine. By the way, if you haven't started it already, you should do that. And the next step, that we actually need to do is we actually need to discover what IP address the virtual machine, is actually running on, or the IP address of the virtual machine. And again, we can do this through the use of various tools, one of which is, of course, Nmap. The other one is NetDiscover. But for the purpose of this video, we are going to take a look at how to do it with Nmap. Now, as I said, right out of the gate, we don't know what IP address the Windows 7 virtual machine has. So in order to do this, or in order to discover the devices and virtual machines that are currently on our virtual hacking lab network that we set up, or our NAT network, we can actually perform a ping sweep with Nmap. All right, so a ping sweep will essentially just discover all the devices on the network and will not perform any port scanning or operating system detection or service detection. So to do this, we're going to say sudo nmap, and then we provide the options here, which is going to be SN. And then we provide the network subnet, so 10.10.10.1, and then the entire range, so 24. So that's going to scan the entire network subnet or the entire network range here. We hit enter, and again, we want to give this a few seconds, and there we are. So you can see we were able to discover that 2 devices are actually actually have the MAC address that actually directly corresponds to a VirtualBox virtual machine. And in this case, we can see that with the first one here is 10.10.10.5, which is our Kali Linux IP address, or at least in my case, it is the Kali Linux IP address. So the 10.10.10.10 is the IP address for the Windows 7 virtual machine. So now that we know what IP address the Windows 7 virtual machine has, or actually is assigned to, we can now perform an operating system scan, or rather we can perform an advanced scan to detect the operating system, the exact version of the operating system, and perform service version detection for any services that are running on the virtual machine. So to do this, we're going to say sudo and nmap, and then we're going to say A, which stands for advanced. We're performing an advanced scan, and then we're using a timing option 4 to speed up the scan. And we're then going to type in we can actually just type in the IP address, which we actually know now because we've been able to identify it. So we can then hit enter. And again, give this a few seconds to a few minutes. Again, based on the fact that we're performing an advanced scan, it's going to take longer than a simple ping sweep scan. All right, so again, we're just going to give this a few seconds to a few minutes to complete. All right, so the scan is complete, and as you can see, it displays a ton of information that right now may not make a lot of sense. But again, the most important piece of information that we're looking at here is going to be the operating system detection, right? So we can see under the SMB OS Discovery Scripts scan results here, you can see that the operating system it was able to detect that the target or the virtual machine is running is Windows 7, in my case, Windows 7 Ultimate, build 7601, and it's service pack 1. All right, so this information will be useful when trying to identify vulnerabilities for this particular version of Windows. Now, another entry point or attack vector is of course going to be your services. Now, in our case, the Windows 7 virtual machine is not running any particular services or any noteworthy services that can actually be exploitable. These are pretty much the standard Windows services. You have MSRPC, you have SMB, that's running on 139 and 445. right? And what we can do now is we can actually go through the process of importing the Nmap results into the Metasploit console. Now the way we can do this is, firstly, we actually need to output this particular scan or these scan results into an XML file, and Nmap already does this for us. So again, what we're going to do now is we're just going to navigate to my desktop because that's where I want to save this particular scan. And we're just going to run a similar scan, but we're going to speed it up in this case. So we're going to run a half open scan. And again, we're just performing an advanced scan, and we'll speed it up using the timing option. So T4 is the profile. And then we're going to also scan all ports. So 56,535 ports, and then provide the IP address of the target. And then finally, we're going to output the results into an XML file. This can be done by using the -O and uppercase X command or X key. And we then need to provide the output file. The output file, again, we can just rename it or name it to whatever we want. In our case, I'm just going to rename it to Windows 7.xml, right? And that is going to export the result for us into this file, which we can then consequently import into the Metasploit console or into the Metasploit database, so that we can start identifying vulnerabilities. So I'm going to hit enter, and again, the scan is going to take a while, so we're just going to wait for this to complete. All right, so the scan is completed, and as you can see, Nmap should have exported the scans into an XML file that we can then import. So the next step, of course, is going to be to import this into the Metasploit console. So to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to start up the Metasploit Framework console, or MSF console, and again, give that a few seconds to start up. And again, once we import the results, or once we import the results from the XML file, we should be able to view them within the console and start identifying potential vulnerabilities within the operating system, or that specific version of the operating system. And of course, the same process can be repeated for services. Now, of course, as I mentioned in the book, we're not going to be focusing on using automated vulnerability assessment or scanning tools like OpenVAS or Nessus, primarily because it's very important to learn how to identify vulnerabilities manually instead of relying on automated tools. And again, it makes you a much more skilled penetration tester. So again, to import it, we're just going to say db import, and then we're going to specify the directory where the XML results were stored. In our case, it's under my home directory, under the user Kali, and in the desktop, well, I actually don't need to provide my home directory there. So home Kali, and under the desktop, we're looking for Windows 7.xml, hit enter. That is going to import the Windows 7 results, Nmap results. So there we are. It's going to import the host for us. And we want to give this a few seconds. All right, so it's imported the results for us. So what we can do now is, just to confirm that the host has been added, we can say hosts u, and you can now see that we have the Windows 7, well, it's actually detected as Windows Vista here, but we have the host 10.10.10.10 added here, the MAC address, the operating system name, etc. All right, so what we can do now is we can list the services for the particular IP addresses, so or the particular IP address. So we can list the services running on, the IP address 10.10.10.10, and we can see right over here under the SMB port, because the Nmap scan used an SMB script that actually enumerated what version of the operating system is running. We can get the operating system version here, which again tells us is Windows 7 Ultimate 7601 Service Pack 1. Okay, what we can do now is we can actually start identifying vulnerabilities for this particular version of Windows. So to do this, we can use Google. So we can type in for example, Windows 7 Ultimate 7601 Service Pack 1, and then we can limit this to exploitdb.com, which is an exploit database. So we can then limit that using a Google dork, so site, and then we say exploitdb.com, and we hit enter, and that's going to list out all the vulnerabilities for this particular version of Windows. So if we click on the first one, let's see whether we have anything there. All right, so we can see that this particular version or build of Windows is vulnerable to the Eternal Blue exploit. All right, so the Eternal Blue exploit is again an exploit that allows attackers to remotely execute arbitrary code by exploiting a vulnerability in Microsoft's SMB version 1 protocol. So Metasploit already has a built-in module for this particular exploit, or it already has an exploit module for this particular vulnerability. And what we can do is we can search for that vulnerability. So we can say search Eternal Blue, and that'll bring up the actual modules here. Let me just zoom out so it's clear. There we are. So I'll just run the search one more time so that it's clear. There we are. So we can see we have it right over here. The exploit Windows SMB MS17010 or 010 Eternal Blue. And again, it is you have the actual vulnerability code there, and you can see this is for the SMB remote Windows kernel pool corruption. All right, so in order to use this module, we need to first of all verify whether this particular operating system or target VM is vulnerable to this particular exploit, because it could be patched. Now, luckily for us, Metasploit also provides us with an auxiliary module. Now, an auxiliary module, as I explained in the book, is essentially a module that's used to scan, is used for scanning purposes. So in this case, it's going to scan the target. This module will scan the target and will actually perform a detection for this particular exploit or vulnerability. So we can copy the actual name of the module, and then all we need to do to use it is say use and paste in the actual module name. We can then now show the module options by typing in show options. And the only option that we need to change in this case is the rhosts option, which is the target IP. So we say set rhosts, and you then want to set your Windows 7 virtual machine IP address here. And once that is done, we can then hit run. And in our case, you can see it tells us host is likely vulnerable to this particular vulnerability. And it then prints out the operating system version and the architecture there. So now that we know it works, we can actually go back to the module here, the Eternal Blue module, and copy that. And we can then say use and then paste in the module name there. And it's going to set the default payload to Windows x64 or 64-bit Meterpreter reverse TCP. So this will give us a reverse TCP Meterpreter session on the target, and it is 64-bit, which in our case is actually correct. Right over here, we can see the target is a 64-bit operating system, or is running a 64-bit version of Windows. So now that we know that, we can actually show the module options here. So show options. And again, what we need to do is set rhosts. We need to set the rhosts value to the target IP address. So set rhosts to 10, 10, 10, 10. And the R port is set correctly because SMB is by default configured on port 445 on the target. So once that is done, all we need to do is set run. But one other key feature or area that you need to be very focused on is the payload options, because the payload options are going to determine the actual how the or the actual connection as to where the Meterpreter session will actually spawn. So you may want to make sure that your L host or the listen address is set to the Yocali IP address, and the L port is set to a port that's currently open and available for connection. So once that is confirmed, just hit run. And it's going to begin the exploit. So again, we're just going to wait for that to complete. If it's successful, it should provide us with a Meterpreter session, and we should have gained initial access to the target system. All right, so after a few tries, we're able to get access to a Meterpreter session, and we've successfully been able to gain initial access or our initial foothold on the target system. So that was a demonstration of how to go from information gathering to identifying a vulnerability and exploiting it in order to gain initial access to the target system. And in this case, we were focused on the Windows 7 virtual machine. Now, of course, this process can be repeated on the Windows Server 2008 virtual machine, which is the Metasploitable 3 VM. And of course, for Metasploitable 2, you can follow the instructions in the book to actually gain access that way, as we've outlined below. So Again, the process is fairly simple if you follow the methodology outlined, from information gathering to identifying vulnerabilities using the various tools that we covered in the book, and then of course gaining access. Once you have access to all the target VMs, we can then move on to the next stage or the next chapters in the book that actually involve getting started with the enumeration process and finally elevating privileges on the target system. With that being said, I'll be seeing you in the next CIA or Code in Action video for chapter 4.